Okay, next we're going to take a look at persisting our login, which means when we do refresh our page, we don't immediately effectively log out and have to type our username and password in again. Now we're going to use a browser feature for our persistent storage, and inside our application, and here's one from testing, let's just remove that token. But inside our browser's local storage, we have an area of persistent storage. Inside here, we're going to store our user object that contains our username and our token. Now, please don't worry about any perceived security issues with what we're doing right now. Our goal remains the same, is to build our user interface and have the facility to log in and register users. We're not creating bulletproof security at this point of development. We'll talk about security later when we get to .NET identity, but for the time being, when we do log in, we're going to store inside local storage the username and token. And that's a persistent storage area where when we do something like refresh our page, for instance, we can fish out the token from there. And another thing that we're going to look at to help us persist our login is using signals inside our account service. And signals are great. I think they were released in Angular 15, possibly Angular 16, but previously we needed to use observables to store this kind of data. And observables worked, but they're a bit heavy hitting for something like this, where we have effectively a value that can change, and we want to do something depending on the value of that variable. Whereas observables are really good for things that change over time, such as a stream of data. So in this example, we're going to be using a signal, Angular signal, to store our current user object. So I'm going to declare another class property of current user, and I'm going to set this to be a signal that we get from Angular core, and we need to give this a type. And I'm going to say this is going to be a user, or it could be null. And when we have two different options, we separate the types with a pipe. But we don't even have a user object yet to work with, and we'll create an interface to describe the shape of the user object. Now inside our folders, I'm just going to right click the app folder and say new folder, and I'm going to say underscore models and press return. Inside this models folder, I'm going to create a new file and call it user.ts. And inside here, I'm just going to export an interface and call it user. And I'm going to define a username, which is going to be a type of string, and also a token, which is also going to be a type of string. Now, this interface is not like a C# interface that represents a contract. We use this, or the way that we are using this, is to describe the shape of the user object. And when we do use this object, then we can expect a username and a token, because both of these properties are required. If we did want to make them optional, then we could do so by using the question mark here, and then the username may be a string, or it may be undefined. If we hover over the property, we can see which options it has. But we want both of these properties to not be optional. Now there's a number of different ways of doing the same thing when it comes to TypeScript. And we're using an interface here, or at least I am. We could also just use a type and say export type user, and then we'd say equals, and then we'd have exactly the same kind of functionality. We've described the shape of an object. Either approach is viable for what we're doing right now, but I'm going to stick with interfaces because that's what I used before in the original version of this training course. And even though, because of the nature of updating a training course, I incorporate as many new things as possible, where I can keep the things I did one way a few years ago, I am keeping it the same way. And that's the basis for using these folder names and using the interface here. And it's not a convention, by the way, for an interface in TypeScript to be prefixed with I, like it is in C#. That's not a convention that we need to stick to. and we could just give our interface the name of the thing that we're describing here. So back in the account service, now I can put my cursor inside the user and I can add the import from models user. And then we can give our current user its initial value. Now its initial value is going to be null. Now, when we log in, we need to do something to set the current user. And in our login, this does return an observable to us. And we need to modify or transform or do something with this observable inside the service. So in order to do something with the observable, we need to use RxJS operators. And in order to use them with an observable, we need to use this pipe or chain on this pipe function. And do we get this from anywhere or do we just use it? And nope, we can just use it. Okay, so we're going to use this pipe and then we can use RxJS operators inside here. Now RxJS operators really are just similar to JavaScript functions, but they work on observables rather than JavaScript objects. Now our goal here is to do something with the return value from this HTTP request. So in order to transform or do something with the return, the response that we're getting back from our API, then we need to use the map operator that we get from RxJS. And inside the map function, we'll just open parentheses, and the map function allows us to project, is its description. But we're going to get access to the response. And inside our response from our API is a user. We're returning a user DTO from our API server. Then we add the arrow and we'll open up curly brackets. And inside this map function, we can execute a callback function effectively. And the user is what we're working with because that's what we're returning from our API. Now inside here, we're going to check to see if we do have a user to work with. So we'll add that as a conditional. And if we do, then we're going to say local storage and we're going to set item. And in quotes, we're going to give our item a key, a name that we can refer to. So I'm going to say user. And then we're going to store our user, effectively, the username and token, in local storage. But this needs to be a string. So we're going to use the JSON stringify function and pass in our user to that. At the same time, we're going to set our current user signal to the value of the user. And signals are beautifully simple to work with. And all we need to do to set the value is say list.currentUser set, and then we can pass in the user. And we're getting a warning here, and why is this? Well, if we hover over this, it tells us that the type of object is not assignable to parameter of type user. And effectively, we've specified a type for our signal, but what we get back from our HTTP GET request, if we hover over the user, well, this is typed as an object. And we need to give our HTTP POST request its return type. So inside the HTTP POST, we can say that this is returning to us a user. And now if we hover over the user that we get back, then this is going to be a type of user and our complaint has gone away. So that's how we set a signal. And below our login, we're also going to add a logout method in our service as well, and effectively do the opposite of what's going on here. So we're going to say local storage.remove item, and we're going to use the user, which is the key that we're using up here. So these need to match effectively. And then we're going to say list.set or listCurrentUser.set, and we're going to set this back to null when we do log out. So that's going to work when we log in and log out, but it's not going to solve the problem that we have when we do refresh the browser. For that, we're going to need to go to our root component, which is our app component. So let's head over there next. And we need to do something when our app is initialized effectively. Now we've got a bunch of code here that we're not really, or we don't really need, but we're going to keep it in place for the time being. And I want to move this code out of the ng on init. So I'm going to create a method called getUsers. and I'm going to cut the request here and put it inside this get users method, and then inside the ng on init, so that we don't break stuff just yet, I'm just going to call the get users method. And inside here we also need to inject our account service. So I'm going to say private account service equals inject, and then use the account service. And I'm going to create a method for setting of the current user. So I'm going to call it set current user. And then I'm going to check what's inside local storage. So I'm going to say const user string equals, and I'm going to say local storage and get item, and then we use the same key of user. And because this might be null, we don't know if we do have or do not have the user at compile time, so we need to check for this. And I'm going to check to see if the not user string, then we're just going to return, as we want to break out of this function, as if we do not have the user string, then we cannot do anything else with it. Then I'm going to say const user equals, and we're going to pass our string into a JSON object. So we use json.pass to do that, and then pass in the user string. And then we can set our current user object, or our current user signal, inside here, and I'm going to say this.account service and current user and set, and then we can pass in the user from here. So with this work in place, we can now head back to our nav component, and inside our nav component we do have access to our account service, but we're just going to use our account service directly inside our nav component's template. In order to make that happen, we don't want this to be private, we need this to be not private. As our template is not in the same class, it's considered a child class of our nav component. So we need to remove private from there. We don't need our logged in property anymore, so we can remove that. And I'll also remove it from here as well, because we're going to be using our signal from this point forward. And in our login method and logout method, instead of list logged in equals false, we can now call our account service logout method. And then we just need to update our template to use our current user object instead of that logged in flag. So inside our nav component, where we've got our conditionals, we're going to say if account service.current user, and then to use a signal we have to use parentheses to get and read the value of that signal. And I'll just do the same for the next check as well. And I'll do the same for the third one as well, so not current user. Now with this in place, what we should have is persistent login. So let's go take a look. And I'm just going to, well, let's open up the Chrome DevTools again, just to make sure everything is working as expected. So I'm going to log in as Dave with the password once again. And everything's the same right now. I've got the welcome user, the drop down still working, and I can see the list of links. And if I refresh the page, that did not have the desired effect, but I remember now I forgot to add in our app component. Let's go back to this one. I created the function for set current user, but it doesn't do anything if we don't actually call it. So inside the ng on init, I need to call the set current user function. Now if I go back to the browser now, I can see I'm already logged in, because inside the application, inside local storage, we do have our user object that contains our username and our token. And if I refresh the page, then I remain logged in. And that's only going to change when I log out, and then my username and password form is now visible again. So signals are really easy to use, they're excellent to use, and we've got a lot of benefits over the way that I used to have to do this using observables. But the main factor is simplicity, how we get the value and set the value, and we'll be using them more for other things in this training course. So now we've got our persistent login. Next we're going to take a look at adding a home page to our application.